Last night I again took 2 Seroquel to go to sleep, and I didn't go to sleep until like 1 o'clock because I was up editing all the videos I made when I was totally dulled out. Yet somehow I managed to make 5 videos, and then when I was editing, I took notes. I thought I would just be dull and be able to just edit things and not really see anything else that I wanted to say, but that didn't happen to be true. So maybe my body's adapting to being dulled out a little bit, I don't know. So it's interesting, since I was able to prevent this from going into any full-blown crisis, which I'll never know if it was going to, but I stopped it earlier than last time. Unless this was just a warning sign and then there's bigger and worse stuff to come, I don't know. I hope that's not the case. So hopefully I've gotten to a point where I can modulate this and regulate this experience of this process happening. And I feel like if I was able to be supported through it, I might be able to just have my consciousness die back and then come out of it okay, but I can't really chance that right now. And maybe that would be a cool thing to make videos about in the future when I have a supported environment, if possible. It might be kind of scary, but it would be interesting in a way to see what it's like when consciousness dies into itself. And sometimes I get this sense that this happens because I was supposed to die years ago and I sort of escaped death. I'm not sure how it works. It's not something I want to consider thinking about right now. And 2 days ago, I forgot to mention that it was 9 months of self-dialogue. And also it was the 200th video on that list of videos. So 200 videos in 9 months. And right now, where am I at? I'm just really feeling like I want to get to emotional CPR. I booked a hotel room, I booked a rental car, and I'm having this sense that it's one of those things where I get to the upper limit of how far I can go, and then have to sort of start again. And I'm kind of realizing while I'm saying that I'm not sure what that I is trying to accomplish. Maybe the I can only go so far, and the rest is up to something else. Or consciousness goes that far and then has to come back and start again, like dying a number of times in life. It's like wiping the brain clean, but then there is some sense of memory of self, and it might not even be stored in the brain, it might just be stored in the body, or stored as knowing that there's some kind of recognition of who one is. I don't even know where to begin in terms of talking about my notes. I took 25 pages of notes between last night and today. And it's strange because often when I have an insight into something, it feels like, wow, not like that's it or anything, but it just keeps going. It just keeps going and going and going. Like I could talk to myself forever. And I was listening to an interview or a talk with Dr. Daniel Siegel today on a neuroscience online summit. And it was a very fascinating talk. I really like his work. And I made a bunch of notes and extrapolations that I want to talk about. But one thing he said at the end of the interview was that we are nature and we are each other. So I always find it fascinating when people say these things that is something someone who is in so-called mania or psychosis might say, and they're saying it from an actual felt sense experience that they're touching and tasting in that moment. Yet if that person is different than usual and having other traits of certain so-called symptoms, then they're called mentally ill, when really to me it seems like their mind and their brain is touching something beyond. And people will say those things intellectually, and they're saying them based on maybe physics or different scientific theories that, oh yes, there's this oneness, or maybe they've had a tiny taste of it, but some of us have been immersed in it. And since we're not used to that mode of operating, it can't last as it is right now. And then when we come back, we're like fried. And instead of being cared for, we're called mentally ill. And it's just a bit bothersome that all these amazing researchers aren't quite piecing this together. And a lot of times I think it's because they've never been there. They're researching this state and these places and these physiological things and neuroplasticity and all these things, but they've never been in that state where all cylinders are firing in all areas at the same time, and what that's like. And I just want to say, for the sake of talking to myself sake, that he was mentioning stuff about integration and how integration is linking the differentiated areas of, say, the brain, and how people in bipolar disorder, they're having a problem with those linkages, and so they're not integrated and they're not integrating. And I would say that there's something more to that, and I don't know for sure, but I have this sense that if the brain is catapulted into a different dimension, one that is based on oneness and all these other principles and laws of life that we don't operate on a daily basis, if that consciousness is a consciousness of we, and I'm not separate and I don't feel myself as separate at all, then to me it makes sense that that brain would become disintegrated in terms of the me and the separate self. So the current supposed integrated state of the brain is of this self-sufficient individual ego, and that's the vantage point. So if somebody goes into this world of oneness and synchronicity, the brain is trying to integrate into something else, and it fails when it comes back down, and then people of regular consciousness say, oh, you're bipolar, or you're schizophrenic or something. The brain doesn't want to integrate into this society. The current integration and healthy brain is healthy in the context of this unhealthy society. So to me, what he's saying with that doesn't quite make sense. I think that if one of those supposed disintegrated brains was invited into dialogue and to actually share their perspective of what it's like to go to that other world, to have that brain state, then in talking with people who haven't been there, there might be some common ground, and there'd be an integration between people that have been there and people who haven't, and that would bridge both brains to be able to integrate up to a different level of seeing and being that isn't necessarily completely all the other world, but it's not just this one. And people would love to have those conversations, but any of those conversations are always being received as this is pathological. Yet an integrated brain in this current level of consciousness, or somewhat a little bit higher, can say, oh, we're one and we're one with nature. Well, we sure are, and I've felt that, and I've been that. And maybe back here, when the brain comes back here, it's blown apart in disappointment that other people can't see it and feel it too, and be there too with that person. So the brain has to come back here, and it basically falls apart. And then it's, recovery back into integrating into this crummy society. So there's a little bit something missing there. And he mentioned that some researchers found that things like bipolar and schizophrenia demonstrated impaired integration. And I think that when we go into map consciousness and trans consciousness, our brain goes into a state of integrating with the whole as the whole. So we're integrating nature. We're actually becoming one with nature, and we are one with nature. And to be one with nature, the current integration circuits have to disintegrate. So I feel like we have a brain state that is integrated when it's in that level of consciousness, but will never be measured when we're in those levels of consciousness. Because how can a person who's not in that level of consciousness even see what's happening there? And he also said, what's important is that every mechanism of regulation that we could look for, we couldn't find a single piece of evidence to go against the following statement, that neural integration is the essential mechanism beneath the regulation of anything we could look for. And I wonder, what about what you can't look for? And I do agree that neural integration is key, but what I'm wondering is that in that state of, say, so-called mania, something else is being integrated beyond. So if somebody's in a very high state, hyper learning, very active, doing things, and like a kid again, that's changing the brain in lots of ways. And then when we come back to regular consciousness, the brain seems disintegrated. Well, it's actually just become non-adaptive to the current structure of society, which is actually the point of map consciousness, to see a better world that's existing right now, which is a different brain state and brain traits. And we could have those brain states and traits if they weren't received as crazy. It's difficult to put into words the flavor of what I'm feeling about that. It's like going to this other state, this other world, and knowing that one's brain is now adapted for that world. And when it comes back to this world, it's difficult to operate. It's like walking in poison. So why would the brain want to reintegrate into this poison world and being okay with it? Because it's not okay in comparison with what we've seen. So our brain has gone beyond integration. It's disintegrated to the me. And everything in recovery is to get this me back and functional and integrated to move about as an individual in society. Well, maybe there's a higher level of organization. And I've been there, but it seems that the brain is not quite completely adapted to that world, and it's definitely not wanting to reintegrate into this world. So it's in this mode of bouncing between the two. And we go up to the other world just enough to allow the mind to create that world through us. And we come down to this world just enough to let the mind continue to create this world, this crappy world that we all share. Because if the brains really went up to that other world, the lower world would fall apart. So really, we're the links to this other world that we've already seen, and it's one already, not intellectually, but actually. So we're, in a way, the neuroplastic humans that are reaching into that other world with our brains, and it's pulling us up there. But we fall back down, and we need some compassion. Not being said that we're defective and we can't integrate. We're holding the two worlds together. Because if it gets to a point where the mind no longer wants to hold the two worlds together, the so-called integrated world of people walking around feeling like they're separate is going to implode. It doesn't take much to disintegrate in a supposedly integrated mind. Just like was mentioned with the open system and the non-linear and the tendency towards chaos. Well, that's what happens to people who go into altered states like mania and psychosis. The only difference is that when that happens on a mass scale, people who have already gone there will be used to it. And then all the so-called integrated people won't be. So in my mind, the integrated people need to learn from these so-called dysfunctional, disintegrated people. They're dysfunctional because they're half walking in a world of oneness, and they're tripping over this crappy society. And yes, we are nature. And when we destroy too much of the differentiated, complex nature that holds everything together, it will release a terror of thoughts so awful that we won't know what hit us. Because we're destroying nature's complexity and diversity. I shouldn't say stuff like this, but I can see how easily it would happen. Thought is supposed to be a helpful tool for human beings to share energy and information flow, to create, to celebrate, and to preserve complexity and diversity of the Gaia sphere, not just humans. But now we've used it to own things and create these me's, these separate me's, and these me's that want to cling and accumulate things while people starve and diversity gets destroyed. And we wonder why kids are being born with brains that can't integrate any of this shit, because none of it's worth integrating. And we've hit a critical point where the diversity of nature is being destroyed too much, to the point where now, unfortunately, consciousness can't even enter the human body properly. The energy and information flow of thought and knowledge can't enter the human brain. Our most prized possession, now children can't even absorb it. So of what value is it? So if the mind uses the brain to create itself, the mind sees through the brain and sees through the eyes. And it doesn't like what it sees. It's trying to get humans to see things beyond just the me and personal thought complexes. The mind sees what's happening to the whole mind, to the whole manifest mind. The unmanifest mind sees the manifest mind and modifies the body to gesture in a different way, to act upon the mind, to regulate it. The brain must disintegrate from the me in order to integrate nature and relationship. If one doesn't become a nature mystic, seeing the beauty and value of nature, he will attempt suicide. Well, I think that's enough angry messages for one day. I don't need to get myself all worked up. But it's okay, because I can just poison my brain into being some semblance of myself. We're so integrated into the world of thought, of me, my knowledge, my this, my that. We don't know there's another faculty of the brain beyond that, which is intelligence. Thought is the intellect, but it's not intelligence. And intelligence integrates something else. And maybe intelligence is what disintegrates the so-called normal integration of the brain that is actually just neurotic. We are disintegrated from nature. And if the mind uses the brain to create itself, it's going to use thought to destroy the me. And the me is just thought. But the trouble is that when thought tries to destroy the me and one is strongly tied to that, one might think that they need to end their life. And I think map consciousness is the energy of integrating the mind. And people who go into map consciousness need to be supported to integrate the mind. And one way we can help integrate the mind is to talk about experiences of the mind. And he talked about a definition of energy. He said, the movement from possibility to actuality through a series of probabilities. And I wrote down, that's what mania is. Everything feels possible and that becomes actual. through a series of probabilities. But the trouble is that when one is in that state of possibility and moving it into actuality, as time goes on, the probability increases that one will be called insane, because a person in that state appears crazy to the mechanical mind. So there needs to be some kind of dialogue with mechanical minds to understand this life process of the mind and let it know that it's not pathological and that it needs to be supported, because it's actually an integration beyond the current integration. But it's being held back by the current level of integration that thinks that it's healthy. That other world is moved by love, and how do we increase the probability of getting to that world moved by love and not by thought, where we move with the world as the world and not as an abstraction